Hi everyone, it's Kendall here, and what I have for you today is week number 14 of our Grandma's Kitchen Quilt-along, which is hosted by Pat Sloan at her website, ilovetomakequilts.com. If you haven't done so already, jump over to Pat's website, download this week's free pattern, come back here, and I'll show you how I do it. On the table in front of me, I have some, but not all of the pieces that I need to make this week's block, and you will notice that I have some rather large squares there. That is because I decided to make one lot of my half square triangles 8 at a time. We need a total of 10, and then I'm going to make the other ones with the 2 at a time method. I also have the two 3.5 inch fabric squares that are required for the corners of this block, but what I forgot to cut were the 4 light fabric squares that were also 3.5 inches, and you'll see me get to those later in the tutorial. To make the half square triangles 8 at a time, because I want 8 that are identical, I'm going to take this large 8-inch light square. So we have cut that at 8 inches, and I'm going to draw a diagonal corner to corner in both directions. I'm then going to match that right sides together with my large print fabric and take that to the machine and stitch 1/4 inch on each side of both of these drawn lines. While I'm at the sewing machine, I'll also get the 2 at a time method ready, which we've done thousands of times before, which is almost identical. I'm going to grab the light fabric and draw just one diagonal line corner to corner on the back of that, match that right sides together with my print fabric and stitch 1/4 inch on each side of the drawn line. If you wanted to use a variety of fabrics for this block, you could very much do that, and then the 8 at a time method probably isn't for you. Doing the 2 at a time method, you could have up to 5 different fabrics if you like. If you just wanted 2 different fabrics, you'd do one lot 8 at a time maybe, and just do 2 at a time for the 2 half square triangles in the center of the block. There is freedom of choice with this, and there are a million different ways to make those half square triangles. I just chose to do the 8 at a time method to show you something a little bit different for this week's video. Once I have actually stitched on each side of my drawn lines on all of my pieces here, I will give everything a press first to settle down those stitches, making sure any tension that was caused sewing across the bias is gone, and then we will cut these in a very particular way. For the 2 at a time half square triangle method, we simply just have to cut this now in half on our drawn line, but for our 8 at a time method, we do need to do something a little bit different. Because we know that we cut our squares at the 8 inches, we need to first of all cut this in half at the 4-inch mark, both vertically and then horizontally. So we'll line up that 4-inch mark on the corner, on the edge, of our fabric and slice that first vertically. We'll then, without moving anything, place our 4-inch line along the base of our large square and cut that on that mark horizontally. We do these two first as there's no drawn line to follow, and if things get separated from this point, you have the diagonal line now to cut on to give you the 8 at a time half square triangles. Now this method is nothing magic, it's just if you want to make half square triangles 2 at a time for a 3.5 inch unfinished, we start with a 4-inch square. That allows for a little bit of trim down. So to make the 8 at a time, we're just compounding that 2 at a time by 4. So we start with an 8-inch square of fabric. It's just like magic. You can go to 8 1/4 if you want a little bit more wiggle room with your trimming down, but it's really not necessary. Now that we have all 10 of our half square triangles made in an instant, we will press all of these to the darker of our 2 fabrics. If you know me, and you should by now, you will know that I like to trim my half square triangles down 2 at a time because I like to save time, I'm impatient, and I need quick results. So to do that, we just make sure that our seam allowances are very snugly nested to allow for 100% accuracy. After we've done that, we'll grab in our 6.5 inch Creative Grid square ruler and we'll take note of our 45-degree line. We'll place that line along our stitching line, and then we need to make sure that we have enough fabric outside our trim down measurement of 3.5 inches on all 4 sides, including underneath the ruler, before trimming away those first 2 sides. We then very carefully rotate this block around. You could use a rotating mat at this point if you like, but I like to wing it. We can now place our 3.5 inch measurement on those freshly cut sides, making sure our 45-degree line is still on our stitching, and trim away those final 2 sides. Just like there are a million ways to make the half square triangle units, there are a million ways to trim them down, so you do it in whichever method you prefer. We'll get all of these trimmed down, and then we're ready to move on. We would normally be ready to lay this block out now for its final construction, but it was as I started doing this that I noticed that I had missed the 4 light squares at 3.5 inches. I then pull in a rather large piece of my background fabric, which has another story attached to it, but we're not going to go there, to cut those 4 squares. However, I only cut 2. So then I pull it back in again, I cut the remaining 2, and then we're ready to move on. So with my silly cutting errors resolved, we are now ready to lay this block out as per our pattern, and I've put the insert there on the top right hand corner because the orientation of these half square triangles is really important. So please always refer back to that pattern to make sure that you have everything correct before moving ahead with construction. I decided that I would just construct the rows first of all, and then halfway through I changed the way I'm doing it. But if you keep everything laid out and you stitch something and put it back where it's meant to be, constantly referring back to your diagram, you will have no problems with putting this block together. You will see throughout here that I do start doing the rows, and I'm not pressing anything yet because I want to see which way the block wants to go. After I actually have these segments of the rows sewn, I do decide to do it in 4 patch units, which I spin the seams in the center of each of those. But let's watch through and I'll try and talk to you as much as possible with what I'm doing. But in this first instance, I'm just sewing everything in pairs in those rows and putting everything back on the table where it needs to be, always referring back to our piecing diagram from Pat's wonderful instructions. With our little pairs sewn for each of the rows, this is where I sort of stopped and took a moment. And this is normally, I don't delete a lot of footage from my videos, but sometimes me futzing around with stuff and trying to think ahead, I do take out. But I've left it all in here today just to show you that I think about it as I'm doing it and not before. So while I play around with this and I'm looking at which way these seam allowances want to go, I'm like, maybe I can put these in a 4-patch. No, what if we do the, no, okay, yeah, look. And then I decide on the 4-patch unit. So the pressing for this will become clear as we go along, but basically I'm pressing to the solid piece of fabric, so away from the half square triangles, to sew this middle intersection on this first 4-patch. I'll then assess each of them as I go along and do the same thing. So for this next set, I've got 2 solid squares to go to. That bottom set on the bottom left-hand corner will also go towards the solid squares. And then again for that bottom right-hand corner, I'll just press away from those points of the half square triangles, and that will allow every single one of those intersections to nest for these horizontal seams. With those now sewn, we have 4 4-patch units that we can treat as individual units going ahead, but I'm just keeping them in that reverse order in my little stack here so that I know that I'll have 1, 2, 3, 4 ready to go when we're moving forward. As I said, I will spin the intersections in the center of these, and that's because we do have those half square triangle units coming in, which gives a few extra layers of fabric. To do that, we just need to pick out the few stitches that are on the outside of our stitching line to make sure that we can open that seam allowance up. You also would have seen there that I gave a little clip into the seam for where I've got the 2 half square triangle units put together, and that just allows me to move that seam allowance in the path of least resistance, and clipping into seams is done in garment construction all the time. Now we are able to open that intersection up and press all of our seam allowances in a clockwise direction for this one. And even though the top part there will have one seam going backwards the other way, it just is so that we can have the flattest block possible. So I'll do all 4 of these in the same fashion, and what this actually does is when we come to sew our 4-patch unit together, every single one of our intersections will nest nicely. Now that we have these 4-patch units made and we have our centers spun to perfection, we can lay this out as a final 4-patch, and you will notice that because of all of our pressing, clipping, spinning, that all of our intersections will nest nicely. So we'll start by doing the vertical seams here. We will spin these intersections again on this vertical seam and then do our horizontal seam, and we will also spin those intersections. Spinning the intersections, like I said, and clipping and pointing things in the other directions will allow for every single one of our intersections to sit nice and flat and spinning them all once again gives you the flattest block possible. And there we have it. So a little more involved to make this week's block, given that we do have 16 half square triangles all coming together. But if you institute those seam clipping techniques that we've shared before and spinning those intersections, as you can see from the back of the block here, and you can pause this if you need to see where and when I did what and how, you are most welcome to. But we have our block for this week complete. As with every block from Block Wednesday, Pat does give you a suggested layout to use that block in a full quilt. And here is what this week's block looks like in just the one color. And you rotate the blocks around to create that secondary pattern. So you do a 1/4 inch turn on each one in a large 4-patch type arrangement. And that quilt is 6 blocks wide by 6 blocks long. Here is what that same layout would look like with just changing the color of the corner squares and the 2 half square triangles in the center. Once again, it is that same quilt layout, just with the addition of some sashing and cornerstones. And what I thought was, what would this one look like on point? Because it could change the entire look of the block. And as you can see here, it really did. Then once again, always I add sashing and cornerstones just to mix it up. And who wants to fight with all of those seam allowances? I don't, and I don't want you to either.